In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis sat in his study in Constantinople and drew a map. He drew coastlines he had never seen. He drew rivers that would not be confirmed for 3 more centuries. And at the bottom of the map, stretching across what should have been empty ocean, he drew a landmass, a detailed continuous landmass with bays and inlets and mountain ranges, and a river system flowing inland from the coast. A landmass that, according to every textbook ever printed, had not been discovered yet, would not be discovered for another 300 years. A landmass that, even when it finally was discovered in 1818, was found to be buried under 2 miles of ice, so thick and so ancient that the rock beneath it had not been seen by human eyes in at least 6,000 years. And yet there it sat, on a map drawn in 1513, rendered in accurate detail that matched the sub-glacial. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Of Queen Maud Land so precisely that when United States Air Force cartographers ran a comparison in 1960 using their most advanced seismic survey data, they did not know what to say. The shapes matched, the river system matched, the coastal contours matched. The only explanation that fit the physical evidence was one that the entire framework of accepted history was built to prevent anyone from saying out loud. Someone mapped Antarctica before the ice. Someone stood on that coast, measured those bays, followed those rivers, surveyed those mountains, and committed what they saw to a document that eventually found its way, through a chain of sources that Piri Reis himself documented, into the most controversial piece of paper in the history of cartography. Tonight we are going to follow that chain. We are going to read the map the way a detective reads a crime scene, starting with what is physically there, moving to who could have made it, and ending at the only answer that survives contact with every piece of the evidence. The map exists, the accuracy exists, the ice timeline exists. Everything we need to understand what happened is already in the record. The question is whether we are willing to follow it. Before we look at what the map shows, we need to understand what the map is physically, because the physical object itself contains information that the standard telling of this story consistently glosses over. Piri Reis drew his map on gazelle skin. The hide has been examined by conservators at the Topkapi and by outside specialists, and its dating is consistent with the early 16th century. The inscription on the map, written in Piri's own hand in Ottoman Turkish, tells us the date of composition directly. It says the map was completed in the Islamic year 919, which corresponds to 1513 in the Western calendar. The inscription also tells us where Piri got his information. And this is the part of the story that almost every popular retelling simplifies into a single sentence and then moves quickly past, because if you sit with what Piri actually wrote, the implications begin to expand in directions that are very uncomfortable for the standard model of history. Piri Reis was not exploring virgin territory. He was not a discoverer in any conventional sense. He was, above all else, a compiler, a synthesizer, a man with access to libraries and charts and captured documents that most people in 1513 could not have imagined existing. He was a senior officer in the Ottoman Navy, the nephew of the legendary corsair Kemal Reis, and he had spent decades at sea in the Mediterranean and along the African coast. He had access to the Ottoman imperial archives. He had access to charts captured from Portuguese and Spanish vessels, and he had, by his own written account, access to something much older. He specifically describes consulting 20 different source maps. Some of those sources were contemporary, charts from the age of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, but some of them were not. Some of them, Piri wrote, went back to Alexander the Great. Some of them came from sources he described as ancient, a word that in the context of a 16th century Ottoman scholar did not mean a few decades old. It meant genuinely ancient, pre-Roman, pre-Greek, old enough that even Piri himself was working from copies of copies, documents that had passed through the great libraries of the known world, surviving because someone in each generation had considered them important enough to preserve. The map we have today is actually a fragment. The full 1513 map no longer exists. What survives is the western portion, covering the Atlantic, the eastern coast of South America, the coast of West Africa, and the southern regions. It was discovered in 1929 during renovations of the Topkapi Palace, found in a pile of discarded materials, recognized by a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann, who was cataloguing the palace library, and brought to the attention of scholars worldwide. Piri Reis also produced a second major map in 1528 that is more complete but focuses on the North Atlantic. It is the 1513 fragment that contains the controversial southern landmass, and it is the 1513 fragment that has generated the most sustained and serious academic debate of any cartographic document in history. The landmass in question sits below the depicted southern coast of South America. It is separated from South America by what appears to be a sea channel. It runs roughly east to west across the bottom of the map, and it contains details. It is not a vague smear of coastline. It shows mountain ranges in the interior. It shows a river system. It shows bays and inlets along the coast that correspond, when plotted against modern surveys, to features along the actual subglacial coast of Antarctica. The coast, as it would appear if the ice sheet were removed. This last point is the one that stopped the United States Air Force cartographers cold in 1960, and it is the one that requires the most careful unpacking, because it is both the strongest evidence for the map's impossible accuracy and the detail most frequently mischaracterized in popular treatments of the subject. The man who first brought this comparison to serious scientific attention was Charles Hapgood, a professor of history and anthropology at Keene State College in New Hampshire. Hapgood spent years studying ancient maps and became convinced that several of them showed geographic knowledge that could not be explained by any conventional historical model. His work on the Piri Reis map was published in 1966 in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and it remains the most thorough academic treatment of the subject ever produced. Hapgood was not a fringe figure trying to sell sensation. He was a careful scholar who submitted his findings to professional cartographers and military mapping experts and asked them to evaluate the geometric and technical evidence on its own merits. One of the people he corresponded with was Captain Lorenzo Burroughs of the United States Air Force Cartographic Division. Burroughs had access to the most detailed seismic survey data then available for Antarctica, data gathered during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958, which had included extensive ground-penetrating measurements of the Antarctic ice sheet and the rock beneath it. When Burroughs and his colleagues compared the subglacial topography revealed by those surveys to the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map, their assessment was striking. In a letter that Hapgood reproduced in his book, Burroughs stated that the geographic detail shown in the Antarctic region of the Piri Reis map was accurate when compared to the seismic profile of the subglacial topography. He stated that this level of accuracy would be impossible to obtain without a detailed hydrographic survey, and that the level of technology required to produce such a survey was not generally understood to have existed in ancient times. This was a senior United States Air Force cartographer evaluating the geometry professionally, and the geometry was accurate. Now, the skeptics. Because there are serious credentialed skeptics of the Antarctic interpretation, and their arguments deserve to be stated honestly rather than dismissed. The main counter-argument is that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map is not Antarctica at all, but a conflation of the coast of South America. The argument goes that Piri, working from multiple source maps with different scales and orientations, accidentally double back on the South American coastline, so that what looks like a separate continent is actually a distorted second rendering of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. This is a technically sophisticated argument, and it has been advanced by serious cartographic historians, including Gregory McIntosh, who published a detailed analysis in 2000. McIntosh argued that the apparent Antarctic landmass can be explained by the conventions and errors of early 16th century cartography without invoking any impossible ancient knowledge. The response from the Hapgood school is equally specific. If the southern landmass is simply a distorted South America, then the interior details should match South American geography. They do not. The mountain system shown on the map does not correspond to any South American range. The river system does not correspond to any South American drainage. The bays and inlets, when measured and projected using the same mapping conventions Peary demonstrably used elsewhere on the map, do not line up with any South American coastline. They line up with subglacial Antarctica. And there is a further detail that the conflation theory struggles to handle. The depicted landmass is separated from South America by an open sea channel. If it was simply a misplaced South American coast, why is there water between them, explicitly shown in a map that elsewhere handles coastlines with reasonable accuracy? This debate has not been resolved in the academic literature. Both positions have serious defenders. But what is important for our purposes tonight is what both sides agree on. They agree that the map contains information that cannot be traced to any documented voyage of exploration before 1513. The skeptics say that information was accidentally generated by mapping errors. The Hapgood school says it was deliberately included from an older source. What neither side disputes is the fundamental strangeness of the document. And the strangeness deepens considerably when you start asking the question that most treatments of this map never get around to asking. Even if we accept that the southern landmass is Antarctica, what does it mean that someone mapped it before the ice? Because the ice is not a minor detail. The Antarctic ice sheet is between 6,000 and 35 million years old, depending on which layer you are measuring. The coastal margins, the areas that would be exposed first if the ice were removed to the level shown on the Peary Race map, are somewhat younger. The specific subglacial topography that the map appears to match corresponds to a state of Antarctica that geologists estimate existed somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age, when global temperatures were somewhat warmer and the ice sheet had not yet achieved its current maximum extent, 6,000 to 12,000 years ago. That range puts a potential mapping event somewhere in what mainstream historians call the Neolithic period or the early Bronze Age, a time when, according to the textbooks, human civilization was just getting started. The idea that a civilization capable of conducting hydrographic surveys of Antarctica existed in that period is not just outside the mainstream model, it is so far outside it that most academics refuse to engage with the claim seriously, because engaging with it seriously would require them to acknowledge that the foundational assumptions of the entire discipline are open to question. But here is the thing. The physical evidence does not care about the foundational assumptions of the discipline. The map exists, the accuracy exists, the ice timeline exists, and there is a broader pattern of evidence that surrounds this map, a pattern that the Tartaria researchers have been assembling for years, and which makes the Peary Race map look less like an isolated anomaly and more like a single piece of a much larger and much more disturbing picture. The pattern begins with the maps themselves. The Peary Race map is not the only pre-modern cartographic document that appears to show geographic knowledge that should not exist. There is the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which shows an ice-free Antarctica with rivers and bays, drawn only 18 years after the Peary Race map. There is the Philippe Boische map of 1737, which shows Antarctica divided into two separate landmasses by a subglacial sea channel. That division was not confirmed by modern science until seismic surveys in the 1950s revealed that Antarctica is indeed divided at the base. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. by a body of water buried under the ice. Boitier drew it correctly in 1737 without any known survey of the continent. There is the Haji Ahmed map of 1559, which shows the land bridge between Asia and North America, a feature that was submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and would therefore only be visible to anyone mapping the world before approximately 10,000 years ago. There is the Zeno map of 1380, which shows Greenland beneath its ice sheet with rivers and topographic features that correspond to the subglacial bedrock, information that modern radar surveys only confirmed in the 20th century. None of these maps are consistent with the official timeline of geographic discovery. All of them appear to be drawing from sources that predate the ice, sources that were available to 16th century cartographers because those cartographers had access to libraries and archives that contained material of extraordinary age. The Tartaria framework asks us to consider what that means. If there were cartographic documents in the libraries of 1513 Constantinople that showed the subglacial topography of Antarctica, those documents had to have originated with someone. Someone created the original surveys. Someone stood on an ice-free Antarctic coast and measured what they saw with sufficient precision to produce a document that could still be recognized as accurate thousands of years later. That someone was not a proto-Neolithic nomad with a stone axe. That someone was part of a civilization with navigational technology, measuring instruments and geographic knowledge comparable to or exceeding the Europe of the 15th century. A civilization that existed before the last ice age reached its maximum extent. A civilization whose works were preserved, copied, transmitted, and eventually deposited in the libraries of the ancient and medieval worlds, where they sat waiting for a Turkish admiral with enough curiosity to pull them out and incorporate their data into a map he was making for his emperor. This is the proposition that the Tartaria researchers have been building toward. Not a wild fantasy, not a conspiracy theory with no evidentiary basis, but a careful reading of the physical evidence that begins with the maps and expands outward to encompass architecture, metallurgy, infrastructure, and a global pattern of cultural discontinuity that the official timeline simply cannot account for. Consider the libraries themselves. In 1513, Piri Reis was working in Constantinople, the former capital of the Byzantine Empire, which had been the Ottoman capital since 1453. The conquest of Constantinople brought the Ottoman state into possession of one of the greatest concentrations of ancient learning in the world. The Byzantine libraries, many of which trace their contents back through Rome to Alexandria, contain texts and documents that had been copied and preserved for centuries, sometimes millennia. The Library of Alexandria itself had been a systematic collection of the entire known world's written knowledge, including documents purchased or copied from travelers who brought materials from as far away as India, Persia, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The chain of transmission goes deep. Piri says his source maps included materials from Alexander's era. Alexander lived in the 4th century BC. The materials he collected during his campaigns would have included documents from the Persian royal libraries, from the libraries of Egypt, from the archives of Babylon. Babylon's written records extended back to at least 3000 BC. The Egyptian records extended back further. And in both cases, the archivists of those civilizations were explicitly in the habit of copying older documents and noting when a text was itself a copy of something older. The chain does not end at Babylon. It does not end at Egypt. It trails off into a period that is technically prehistoric in the conventional sense, a period from which we are told no records could survive because there was no writing to record anything. And yet the maps exist, the accuracy exists, and the only mechanism that connects subglacial Antarctic topography to a 1513 Ottoman document is a chain of copying that goes back further than writing, to a source sophisticated enough to conduct surveys and create records that survived into the literate era. The Tartaria interpretation of this evidence is not that there was one lost civilization in Antarctica. It is broader and stranger than that. The Tartaria framework proposes that the world of 12,000 to 6,000 years ago contained a civilization of global reach, significantly more technologically advanced than the conventional model allows, and that this civilization collapsed partially or catastrophically at or near the end of the last ice age. The survivors of that collapse, and the documents they managed to preserve, became the hidden foundation on which all subsequent human civilizations were built. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Chinese, all of them were not starting from scratch. They were inheriting, imperfectly, fragments of a knowledge base that once existed in its complete form somewhere else. The ancient Egyptians described their own civilization as a legacy from a pre-flood age, from the time of the gods, from a period when beings of far greater wisdom had walked the earth and left behind teachings that the priests were dutifully, if incompletely, preserving. The Babylonians said the same thing. So did the Sumerians, so did the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas. Across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, the same story was told. There was a time before the current age, a time of greater knowledge, a time that ended in catastrophe. Something was lost. What we have is the remnant. The Piri Reis map is a remnant. It is one document in a chain of transmission that extends back before the ice, before the catastrophe, before the beginning of what we call recorded history, to people who stood on an Antarctic coast and measured what they saw because they had the instruments and the intellect and the institutional capacity to do so. Their names are unknown. Their language is unknown. Their cities, if they left any, are either under the current ice sheet or under the risen seas of the post-glacial world. But they left the surveys, and the surveys survived. Now we need to talk about the economic and political dimension of this, because the Tartaria framework is not only a story about lost civilizations, it is also a story about who controls the past, and why controlling the past is one of the most economically valuable forms of power that a civilization can exercise. Knowledge of pre-modern geographic accuracy is not merely an academic curiosity. It has direct practical implications for claims of discovery, for territorial sovereignty, for the legal and economic architecture of the modern world. The entire framework of European colonialism rested on the doctrine of discovery, the principle that a European power could claim sovereignty over a territory by being the first to discover it, map it, and declare ownership. That doctrine was the legal basis for the dispossession of indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And its foundational premise was that the Europeans were the discoverers, that before them the territory was unknown, unmapped, and therefore legally available for claiming. If you accept that pre-modern maps of global accuracy exist, and that those maps derive from sources that predate European exploration, then the entire legal and economic structure built on the doctrine of discovery becomes vulnerable. Not just historically vulnerable, but philosophically vulnerable, in a way that raises questions about the legitimacy of land ownership, resource rights, and political sovereignty that are still live issues in the 21st century. This is not a small thing. The stakes involved in maintaining the conventional model of geographic discovery are enormous. They are not merely academic. They are economic and political in the most direct possible sense. A system of global land tenure built on the premise that Europeans were the first to accurately map the world has a powerful institutional interest in that premise remaining unchallenged. The academic discipline of history, the legal institutions of the nation-state, the resource extraction industries whose titles trace back to colonial grants, all of these have a structural investment in a model of history that puts sophisticated mapping capability exclusively in European hands after 1400. The Piri Reis map does not fit that model, so the Piri Reis map has been studied, archived, debated among specialists, and then very carefully never taught to the general public. Not because it has been conclusively debunked, it has not, but because the serious engagement with its implications would require a conversation about the foundations of modernity that the institutions of modernity are not equipped to have. The Hapgood thesis has never been definitively refuted. The Mackintosh critique is serious and should be taken seriously, but it does not explain the interior details, the mountain system, the river drainage, the correspondence with subglacial topography. The debate remains open in the technical literature, and the fact that it remains open, that no one has simply shown the comparison to be false, is itself significant. In academic discourse, when an anomalous claim survives decades of serious critique without being decisively refuted, that is not nothing. That is a signal that the anomaly is real. What happens if the Tartaria hypothesis is correct? What happens if the Peary race map is exactly what Hapgood and his successors claim it is? A document ultimately derived from surveys conducted by a pre-glacial civilization of global reach, preserved through a chain of copying that passed through Alexandria and Babylon and Persia and Byzantine Constantinople, before landing in the hands of an Ottoman admiral who included it in a gift to his emperor in 1513. What does that mean for the world we think we live in? It means the timeline is wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. It means that sophisticated civilization, capable of oceanic navigation, hydrographic surveying, and systematic cartography, existed at least 6,000 years before the earliest civilization that the conventional model acknowledges. It means the Bronze Age and the ancient Near East and the classical world were not the beginning of human sophistication. They were late chapters in a much longer story, inheritors of a tradition that stretched back into the geological deep past, a tradition that was almost entirely destroyed and whose fragments were so thoroughly misunderstood by the inheritors that even the most careful of them, men like Peary Rice, had no idea what they were actually working with. Peary thought his ancient sources were just old maps. He did not know they showed a world that no longer existed. He did not know the coast at the bottom of his map had been buried under ice for thousands of years. He just included the data because the data was there, because an honest cartographer uses every source available to him, and the source happened to be accurate. There is something almost poignant in that. Peary Rice, meticulous naval officer, careful scholar, sitting in his study in Constantinople with his 20 source maps spread out around him, not knowing that one of those sources was a ghost from before the Ice Age, not knowing that the landmass he drew at the bottom of his composition would one day be the most contested feature in the history of cartography. He was just doing his job. He was just compiling what the sources told him. And what the sources told him included something that nobody alive in 1513 should have had any way of knowing. The map sat in the palace library for 400 years. It survived the decline of the Ottoman Empire. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the conversion of the Topkapi Palace into a museum. In 1929 it was found in a pile of discarded materials, recognized, rescued, and sent around the world to be photographed and studied. Every serious scholar who has looked at it carefully has said the same thing in the end, that it contains information whose origin cannot be explained by the conventional model. Every serious scholar has then retreated to the safest available position. Either the details are explained by mapping error, or the implications are filed away and not followed. But the map does not retreat. It sits in Istanbul, on its gazelle skin, with its Ottoman inscriptions and its impossible southern coastline, waiting for a generation of scholars brave enough to follow the evidence all the way to the end. That end is not comfortable. It requires dismantling assumptions about human history that have been foundational for 200 years of scholarship. It requires acknowledging that the story of civilization we have been telling is not the whole story, and may not even be the most important part. It requires sitting with the possibility that we are not the inheritors of a steady upward march from savagery to sophistication, but the survivors of a much older and much more complex story, a story that included a civilization capable of mapping the world in its entirety, capable of standing on an Antarctic coast and recording what it saw, and that this civilization ended so completely that even its maps arrived in the 16th century without anyone knowing who had originally made them. The map of 1513 is a message from before the ice. We do not yet know how to read everything it is telling us. but we can at least start by acknowledging that it is speaking, that the voice is real, and that the person who left it behind was standing somewhere we have been told no one could stand, at a time we have been told no one was ready to stand there, looking out at a coast that has been hidden from human eyes for longer than our entire recorded civilization has existed. That is not a small thing to sit with, but it is an honest thing. And the honest thing, when you are looking at the evidence, is always the place to start.